Well, welcome this morning. We are continuing in our float trip through Genesis. Float trip through Genesis. Yeah, well, it's kind of like when we. Yeah, it's a summertime thing. And when we lived in Spokane, you could float the Spokane River through the Spokane Valley. It's a beautiful. You get an inner tube and go down there, and there's not much exciting on the water, but it's always fun to see what was on the shores as you're going down. Oh, look at that! So that's what we're doing. We're kind of floating down Genesis right now, and we're making note of things on the shore. And what we're looking at specifically is the land of Egypt and the life of Joseph. So we're in the end of Genesis. We're in chapter 41, and we're following the life of Joseph. Why? Because it's an extraordinary demonstration of the providence of God, where God is in control even when you can't tell he is. And so that's what we're looking at. He's a great example of that. We pick up right here, and he's in jail. It turns out that Joseph was taken from his home wrongly at the age of 17. What were you doing when you were 17? Age of 17, he was taken from his home, and now we are at age 30. So imagine being in jail from age 17 to age 30 because of wrong accusations. Totally unjust. And you could be sitting in jail the entire time saying to yourself, woe is me, this isn't fair, excuse me, this isn't fair, I shouldn't be, and you could kind of do a pity party for all those years. But he doesn't do a pity party. He understands in ways that we don't quite get yet that God is in control and there's a purpose to this injustice. I'm going to say that again. There's a purpose to this injustice. And that is what we always have to remind ourselves when we are in the midst of unfair, unjust circumstances. Is God still in control? Yes. There's a purpose to the injustice. So that's where we are today. And we pick up the story. Let me give you a little bit of recap from last week. He's in a jail that has a close proximity to Pharaoh, and he comes to understand that Pharaoh has had some dreams. And these dreams terribly, terribly disturb Pharaoh. He's really messed up about this. We don't think it's due to pizza or whatever they eat in Egypt at the time, but he's deeply disturbed by it. And at the time, dreams were a big, big deal. They were really an indicator of something going on in a dimension outside of our physical one, but they touched into our experience, and so they were deeply disturbing. And rightly so, because these dreams have been given by God. The dreams included cows and grain. And if you were here last week, you had your lovely, plump cows, and you had your scrawny, ugly cows, and you had your grain that was nice and plump and had lots of ear and stuff on it, and then you had the ones that were all dried out and withered. So he sees these numbers 7 in the one, 7 on the plump good side, 7 on the nasty side, both at the cows and the grain. And since these two dreams seem to correlate, there's a 7 and 7 thing going on. Pharaoh is deeply disturbed. He asks all of the big guys in his kingdom who have any kind of spiritual connection, what do these dreams mean? And they all come to him with a resounding, I don't know, shrug of shoulders. And so he asks Joseph. That's what's going to happen right here. Joseph interprets the dream. He comes to him and says, here's what's going on. And this is a pretty famous painting right here. Joseph is, he looks like he's being kind of insolent to Pharaoh right there. He's not. What he's doing is he's doing 5 and 2, which is 7. That's so, okay. Anyway, Joseph interprets the dream and says that there's 7 good years coming and 7 incredibly bad years coming. So bad, in fact, that the nation will completely forget the 7 good years. And it's going to be so bad that it actually puts the entire nation in danger. It could wipe out all of the civilization in Egypt. So 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And then after he interprets the dream, he should have stopped talking. Now, this is still a recap from last week. He should have stopped talking because you only talk to a king when the king asks you a question. But he decides to offer a suggestion. So he offers this suggestion, what I call Joseph's suggestion, and he says, here's what you can do. There's no way you can stop this 7-year thing from happening. But if you put a man in charge who knows this is coming and has confidence this is coming, you can actually store up grain during the good years and eat it during the bad years, and you'll survive. Now, that was a total freebie from Joseph. He says that's what you need to do. Find someone who's capable of doing this. And I'm just going to leave that with you, Pharaoh. You can get through this if you just are wise in the 7 years before, so you can survive the 7 years after. It's a great suggestion. And that's what brings us to today. So Act 1, Genesis 41, Pharaoh has heard the suggestion. Now, what's his response to the suggestion that he finds someone to do this? This is where we pick up today. Verse 37, we're halfway through the chapter. So this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Why shouldn't it? Makes great sense. While you've got lots of stuff, save it. And then you can survive the 7 lean years. It made sense to him. 38, so Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this? Talking about Joseph, who's standing right in front of him. Can we find a man like this? And the way he states it, it's sort of like, we need to find an Egyptian like this guy. But what is his chief job requirement to do this job? And he says it right in the next breath. Can we find a man like this who's smart, who's taken every kind of training class he can take in terms of influencing people and making friends, who knows how to manage and administrate in all the kingdoms of the world, who seems to have the best wisdom in all about how to make things get bigger and better? He's like an Edward Jones consultant or something like that. No. How can we find a man like this? What's his credentials? In whom is the Spirit of God. So clearly, Pharaoh has seen that there's something odd about this kid, this Hebrew, 30-year-old Hebrew. There's something odd about him. He's interpreted dreams for both the baker and the cupbearer that came true. He's giving me an interpretation right now. And it's not because Joseph has any innate skill. Let me say that again. It's not because he has some innate skill. It's because for some reason, inexplicably, Pharaoh recognizes that the Spirit of God is with him. The value to Pharaoh is that this guy has a connection to God. Now, you got to stop and realize how crazy this is. If you know about Egyptian theology, they had many, many gods. There was a god of the Nile. There was a god of frogs. There was a god of fertility. There was a god for everything. Anything, in fact, culturally, anthropologically, in the history of man, if you were going to make a religion, you would create a god who was in charge of the thing in nature that was a benefit to you. So if you needed fertility for your crops, you had a fertility god. If you needed rain for those crops, you had a rain god. If you needed sun for the crops to grow, you had a sun god. If you needed the water from all of Africa and the Nile, then you had a river god. So there's gods on tops of gods on tops of gods. So this is the classic kind of thing. The beneficiary to mankind comes from a panoply of gods who serve man if man serves them. So if man goes, makes a sacrifice, somehow convinces them, please, oh, great God, make the Nile overflow again this year so that we'll have nice dirt in the delta and we can plant, please, oh, please, here's some crops from last year, please, oh, please do this for us. You know, that kind of weird, ignorant sort of sacrifice to this God, and maybe this God will give good stuff to you. That was the mindset. That's the mindset. But now here's this guy standing, this is Pharaoh in charge of all of Egypt, saying, we need to find someone like this guy right here, in whom very clearly the Spirit of the gods, the Spirit of God. One God. One God. One God. This is like a Freudian slip almost, because they've always had multiple gods. They'll have multiple gods after this. They had multiple gods before this. But Joseph has already stood in front of him and said, I have one God. What I'm going to tell you when I interpret this dream comes not from me. It's not in me, he said last week. It's from God. Singular. Singular. So Pharaoh's theology is being turned upside down here. He says, we need to find someone like this guy right here who's got the Spirit of God in him. And I think at this point, if I was going to make a movie, I'd have Pharaoh looking at all of his advisors. Anybody? 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 Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, since God has shown you all this, there's none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. Joseph is still in jail. He's still actually in jail. And Pharaoh says, clearly you've got the Spirit of God. Clearly there's no one else in my kingdom who's like you, so you're in charge of everything. He goes from being in the jail of the captain of the guard to being the prime minister of Egypt in one fell swoop. What? Yes, in one fell swoop. And why? Because the king, Pharaoh, is convinced that this kid has a connection to God himself. So if there really are going to be 7 good years followed by 7 bad years, we need to have a connection to the Creator God that this guy has proven to me exists. So you've got the job. You've got the job. And again, if you're making a movie, you see all the advisors of Pharaoh in the background, they all do this. What? Because how much power does he have? Pharaoh says at the very end of this, you got everything. except the throne itself. So it's like England in that sense, where you have the Queen or King of England, and then you have a Prime Minister. The King or the Queen, they're actually the top. They're the top in that sense. But the Prime Minister runs everything. They're responsible to make sure that everything works. And now Joseph, a Hebrew, not an Egyptian, a Hebrew, has been put in charge of everything. Now Pharaoh can overrule him at any moment, but he has said right here, in the presence of all of Pharaoh's servants, this guy is in charge. Now what we have to do is demonstrate to the rest of the country that this guy's in charge. So Pharaoh goes on and says to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand, that's the special signing ring, from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, oh my gosh, and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So signet rings, you remember, if you were going to give a command as Pharaoh, you had a special engraved ring, and you would have wax that you'd put on your written documents and stuff like that. And only one person had the signet ring, so when you impressed it in the wax, people could say, this definitely did come from Pharaoh because no one else has an imprint like this. So now, Pharaoh has taken the most powerful authority ring, one ring to rule them all, the powerful ring in Egypt, and has given it to Joseph and said, when you imprint this ring, it's as though Pharaoh himself said this. What? It's crazy. Now, if you think this sounds kind of like, I don't know, kind of like fairy tales, let me read you something I found. If you go back to secular history, back to, again, to Egypt, around 600 to 700 BC, there was a pharaoh named Ashurbanipal. I love that name, Ashurbanipal. And he was investing Necho, who was going to be the next pharaoh. He was investing him, kind of passing on the power to Necho. And this is what we find written on papyruses of the time. It says, I clad him in a garment with multicolored trimmings, placed a golden chain on him. That's interesting. Put golden rings on his hands. I wrote my name upon an iron dagger to be worn in his girdle. I presented him with chariots, horses, and mules as means of transportation, befitting his position as ruler. That kind of matches. Yeah, because that's history. That's the way it works. But you know what he didn't do is give him horses. Oh, wait a second. He did. He takes him from being the slave to being this ruler, and the next thing he says, he made him ride in a second chariot. This is cool. How do you tell Egypt this guy's in charge? And they called out before him, bow the knee. Yeah, and he went all through Egypt and proclaimed, because he went in the chariot behind Pharaoh, that this guy's in charge. It's like doing a presidential motorcade in a way. And Pharaoh went through in the first chariot, and Joseph came through in the second chariot, and he had all the people around this big cavalcade say, bow the knee. Speaking of Joseph, bow the knee. This guy's in charge, bow the knee. What? Yeah, everyone in Egypt is supposed to bow the knee. And thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. And moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So if you've been sleeping, here's the recap. He's in charge of everything, okay? So that's where we are. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, which I looked up and couldn't find a really good meaning for, but that's okay. But what's significant is the fact is that he gave him an Egyptian name. And in giving him an Egyptian name, he has basically given him the authority as well there. Do you remember another Old Testament character who did well in the courts of his captors and they gave him a different name? Daniel. And so these things happen. It's a way of saying this guy is now nationalized. He is one of us. He's got a name, and this is his name. Zaphanath-Paneah. And he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Now that's not Potiphar, the captain of the guard. That's Potiphar, different person. But the priest of On. I looked at the priest of On. Very classy, very classy. If you were going to go like to the highest reputation, authority of the priesthood that was in Egypt, that would be On. That would be the priest of On. So what he's basically done is he's also given him in marriage. So he marries into the most influential, well-heeled family in all of Egypt. So now not only does he have an Egyptian name, so he's one of us, but he's now married into one of the most influential families. It's like saying he married him to a daughter of Rockefeller, so now he's a Rockefeller connection, or something like that. You know, all the marriages that are done in history for political reasons, it's exactly the way this is. So there's no way you could look at this Hebrew, Joseph, and say, well, he's not really one of us, because he does have an Egyptian name, and he is married into a classy family. So Pharaoh's got him hooked in. He is just hooked in. He is now in charge of all of Egypt. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. And that's what an administrator does. He goes out and he makes sure everything is humming like it's supposed to hum, and everything's great. And the writer here, Moses, tells us Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 30 years old, after being taken from his home forcefully at 17. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. And again, when it says he went out, that means he was visibly a local manager of the nation. He would go out and he would visit all the time. Now, he was doing more than just visit. Remember, we've got a problem coming. We've got 7 years of good and 7 years of bad, right? So somehow he's got to implement the plan that he told Pharaoh about what to do during the 7 years of good. And that's really important. So that's why he's going around. That brings us to Act 2. So he goes from a slave and a prisoner to the prime minister of Egypt. And now we talk about the attractive and plump years. That was the phrase we used for the cows last week. Attractive and plump. Let's go to the attractive and plump years, the 7 years of good. So 47. So during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of all these 7 years. What did I do? Oh, yeah, all right, okay, Pharaoh's grain, yeah. Okay, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. Now, this is an important distinction, because we saw last week that this was the plan that he proposed. Collect the grain, store it up, put Pharaoh's name on it, and say this belongs to Pharaoh. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. But now he says something interesting, too. He put it in the cities that are dispersed around. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. So, for instance, if these silos, these are not authentic Egyptian silos, just to let you know. These silos that he put all the grain in, if, for instance, they were fields in Avaris, it would be marked as grain of the city of Avaris. Now, why would he do that specifically? Why would he spread out all the storehouses all over the country and put the city's name on it? Although Pharaoh owns the grain, it says the city of Avaris or the city of Memphis. Yes, Memphis is not in Tennessee, it's in Egypt. Or all those kind of places. Why would he put the names and distribute them all over the country? What does that say to the people? That they'll have food and it's local. Now, Pharaoh will control it, okay? Pharaoh will control it and owns it, but it's there in your midst. You can see it. It's right there. So as they put grain into this, they'll know that this is being stored up for them because it's got their city's name on it. Very important distinction right here. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea. How much is that? Until he ceased to measure it. How much is that? It can't be measured. So the writer's trying to tell us it was a lot of grain. So these 7 years of abundance were really 7 years of abundance. Now Joseph, if you remember back last time in the beginning of chapter 41, his proposal he made to Pharaoh was take a fifth, take 20% of all the grain. Now you would think that that would be a hardship on people, except that the harvest was so great that it seems like they didn't even notice the 20%. I mean, so they put it away, and there you go. And it's got their name on it. It's got their city's name on it. Pharaoh's going to control it, but that's a nice thing to have. Now, Joseph, as he's going around as the administrator of this plan, people are going to ask him, why are you taking our grain to Pharaoh? Why are you taxing us 20% of what we're growing? Now, what would Joseph answer? We don't know. It's not written here. But if he was a jerk, he would say, because we can. If he's not a jerk, if he actually is engaged on behalf of God to save the nation of Egypt, and eventually his family, you'll see in a second. But if he's engaged on that part, he would explain, you are living in the midst of 7 years of great abundance. And trust me, this will come to an end, and there'll be 7 years of incredibly bad famine. If we don't put it away right now, you will die. But it's 20% of my grain. I know. We want to have a party tonight and barbecue all the grain and just get all fat. We want to, no? We got to give you a fifth of it? Trust me. You need to trust me. In an amount of time here, it's going to get really bad, and this is going to save your life. Now remember this, because this conversation is something that's going to be necessary to talk about when we get to the end. Joseph has got to convince a nation when it's in plenty that bad is coming. And that's his rationale for doing this. As a good administrator, that's what he's going to have to appeal to over and over. So even in the next year, in the 7 years, but we had even more grain this year. Can't we keep some of it? No, 20%'s got to go into the silos, Fred. They got to go in there. It's going to be there. You're going to thank me about this. Oh, yeah, sure. Someday I'm going to thank you. And 7 years, he's got to make this case until they say, you're at it again. This is the 7th year, and you're taking 20% of our grain. Where's that stupid famine you were talking about? So by the end of 7 years of great life, it's hard to convince people that things are going to go bad. Noah had this problem. While they were still marrying and feasting and all that kind of stuff, then the end came. So Joseph really has more of a job than just administrating. Joseph has a job of trying to convince them that a loving God is trying to save their life. And that's what he'll do. Okay, we move on in this story. Act 3, but not Act 3, an intermission. There's an intermission in all of this. Verse 50, before the year the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Actual photograph, not. Asenath, remember that's his wife, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. So yeah, there you go. Egyptian blood, for sure. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for, Joseph explains, he says, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So Manasseh, the last half of Manasseh means forget. It's caused me to forget. So this son has come to him. He's a father. He's a beaming father. And things seem to be working great. He's the prime minister of Egypt. He's engaged with his gifts from God. And now he has a family. He's got a son. And somehow all those bad years are being replaced now with good. And so he says, Manasseh has caused me to forget. As we get on in age, sometimes we ought to change our names. Manasseh, I'm forgetting all the time. So that's what Manasseh means, to forget my hardship and all my father's house. 52, and the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So Ephraim just means fruitful. That's what it means. So he's caused me to forget, Manasseh's caused me to forget my past and all the hardships I've had. Even all that time in the jail and the oppression and the unjustness and the unfairness, and God, this isn't fair. All of this is now seems to just vanish into the past, and I've forgotten. I'm forgetting that and the hardships I had with my brothers who sold me into slavery, those jerks. He doesn't say that. And now I'm being fruitful, Ephraim. So that's what the two words mean. Forgetful and fruitful. Now we get to Act 3. That was our just a little inclusion. Oops, ugly and thin. So ladies, thin is ugly. Just letting you know. Okay. Ugly and thin. Now, 53. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. This, by the way, is a picture from the Dust Bowls in the early 30s of cattle dying because there's nothing to eat. And I have to suspect it looked even worse than this eventually in Egypt. The 7 years of famine began to come. And then suddenly all those naysayers just said, well, Mr. Joseph, when is that famine coming? Boom, it hit hard. It was just as Joseph had said. Just as he had said. We go on. There was famine in all the lands. In all lands. We're not talking about just Egypt. And in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So we're talking about in the region, it was a famine everywhere, including in Canaan, where Joseph's family is. Everywhere on that end of the Mediterranean, it was famine. But the only people eating bread were the Egyptians, because they had been warned by God it was going to happen, and they entrusted Joseph with a plan that would save them. They had bread. Now, this is worded interestingly. It's like a news flash worldwide. Because as people were in famine, they're saying, where will we find food? And someone would say, hey, guess what? I just came through Egypt, and they're eating bread there. Well, how is that possible? Well, because they stored it up. Let's go to Egypt and see if we get some grain. And that's exactly what happens. They were eating bread. Now, when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh. This is an explanation of that. People cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So Pharaoh is thinking, man, I'm glad I put this guy in charge. And now that they're coming after me, Pharaoh, all I have to say is talk to Joseph. He's in charge. He's the one that implemented the plan. He's the one, more importantly, who knows how to dole out the grain so we can make it through not 5 years or 6 years, but 7 years. So now he has to deal with people saying, we're starving, you have grain. Yes, you can buy it from me. Give me a whole bunch. No, you can only have this much. But I want more than that. You can't have more than that. You can only have this much. Why? Because this is going to be 7 years. Well, oh! So now he's an unpopular administrator because he's going to have to squeeze this out slowly, or else the plan's not going to work. Remember, he only took 20% of the grain for 7 years. So you're not going to be able to eat a full meal every day for the 7 bad years, but you'll have enough to get by. So now he's got to ration it carefully to make sure we get through it. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Now, I want you to see this word sold right here, because what's going to happen, because Pharaoh has taxed the people and taken all this grain, he's going to sell it. That's part of the way that he's going to keep it rationed, because if you don't have enough money, you can't buy a lot. He's going to keep it rationed. But the net result economically to Pharaoh is he's going to get super rich. He's going to get super rich because he owns all this grain. So after these 7 years, Pharaoh's going to come out on the other side having most of the wealth of Egypt. Interesting point. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So because of the foresight that God has and revealed through the dreams of Pharaoh and interpreted through the giftedness he gave to Joseph, people are going to survive the 7 years of drought. They're going to make it through just fine. Not just Egypt, but the entire world. And now with the entire world problem, Joseph has another problem as an administrator. Okay, I've only got so much for Egypt. I only took 20% for 7 years. I mean, that's not a lot of grain, but it's okay. But how am I going to feed the world? How do you do that? Well, now he's going to have to be a tough administrator to limit what goes out to the world as well. Now he's going to have to make these tough decisions about, well, when it comes down to the rationing and I've only got so much for every year, how much do I give preference to Egypt? How much preference do I give to just people who walk into town? What do we do? Do we tell people who walk into town, I'm sorry, this is our grain, can't have any of it, this is for Egypt? Do you do that? I mean, what do you do? What do you do as an administrator who is representing God, in whom the Spirit of God is? Do you act like a jerk to the rest of the world? Or do you allow it to be open to everyone? And that story will be told in the next chapter. Okay, so let's get to the end here. I'm going to make 3 kind of comments on this because the story is very clear. The number 1 comment is about providence. We've talked about this before. Providence is how God works his sovereign actions that look like they're ordinary affairs in people, but he's in control. He's in control. Now remember, if you roll back the story with Joseph, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Totally unfair, totally unjust, and motivated by the hatefulness of his brothers. But was God out of control at that stage of history? He needed the hatefulness of the brothers. He needed the Midianite traders that were coming through at exactly the right time, like within 12 hours. Coming through at exactly the right time so he could sell him. He had to have the Midianite traders. They sold him instead of killing him. He goes down to Egypt, and then he gets sold to someone who's connected to Pharaoh's court. Coincidence? Providence. But then he gets thrown into jail because the captain of the guards, his wife, tries to seduce Joseph, and he resists like a noble guy that he should. He resists wonderfully, and he is rewarded for his noble resistance with jail. Was God out of control? No. He needed him to be in jail. Because while he was in jail, he met 2 guys from Pharaoh's court, a cupbearer and a baker, who both had dreams. And Joseph interpreted the dreams for him accurately. You're going to die, you're going to live. Coincidence? No. Providence. But the guy who lived, the cupbearer, didn't talk to Pharaoh about the guy who interpreted his dreams in jail, Joseph. Joseph said, please, when you see Pharaoh, tell him about me and get me out of this place, because I am unjustly in jail. Was that unjust incarceration providence? Yes. How about the forgetfulness of the cupbearer? Providence. So that when the day came when Pharaoh has a dream, the cupbearer can say, who was this guy in jail? I totally spaced out about him. But he interpreted our dreams correctly. Let's talk to him. Coincidence? Providence. Providence. And so he comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, can you interpret my dream? And Joseph says, no, I don't have it in me. But God can interpret your dream. And so he tells Pharaoh that he will interpret his dream because of what God's going to tell him. But it's God, it's not Joseph. Pharaoh recognizes the Spirit of God in this kid, and he says, you know, that's a great interpretation, but how are we going to make it? And Joseph says, I got a suggestion. Appoint somebody. And it could have stopped right there, and he could have gone back to jail. But then Pharaoh says, I think you're the guy. Coincidence? Providence. Providence. Because the story doesn't end with the feeding of Egypt and the feeding of the nation through the 7 years. Something much bigger is about to happen. Bigger than that? Yes. So again, providence is how God works in what seems like ordinary circumstances in our life. And God gets what he wants to get through us. And we can participate in that and cooperate in that, or we don't. And God is not only providential over us, wait for this, he is providential over the sinfulness of other people to get what he wants. And if your little brain is saying, how does that work? My little brain says, I don't know. But he clearly has in this case. That's what providence is all about. God gets what he wants, even through the sinfulness of people. I don't know how that happens. And so here we have one of the best demonstrations of salvation of a nation and of nations coming through the providential will of God that consciously involved the sinfulness of his brothers, the injustice of the times, the lying of Potiphar's wife, and all of those things which seems like God is out of control, but he's not. Now, we've said this many times before, but in providence, it has such a great application to us because we look at our changing circumstances. And what we say to ourselves in the changing circumstances, especially when they go south, when it gets bad, our first impulse, like the writer of some of the Psalms, is to say, God, have you forgotten about me? Do you see what's going on in my life? Do you see that things are bad? Have you gone to sleep? Some of the Psalms start that way. God, are you sleeping? Don't you see this is bad? This is unjust. I don't deserve this. Many of David's Psalms start like that, especially when he's running away from Saul before David becomes king, and Saul's trying to kill him, both in his chambers and in the Judean desert. This is just so totally unjust. And David starts his psalm saying, God, they're after me. What are you going to do about it? Are you sleeping? This is not right. What? You have anointed me king in my father's household, and yet this is what's happening to me. Our temptation when the circumstance goes south is to say, God's sleeping. But even when the circumstance is unjust, God is not sleeping. He's in control. Yeah. Exactly. God could have said, no famine. Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason for all this, and God could have stopped the famine. He's powerful enough to do that. But in the process of all this, in the providence of God, the providence of God isn't so much to make us comfortable, it's to glorify who he is. It's to glorify who he is. And in a moment here, not only Egypt, but the nations of the world who are in famine are going to understand, as Joseph speaks it, that God himself is offering salvation to anyone who will come and buy. He's already foreseen this. He's foreseen this. So that's providence. And I want you to remember that because we're going to say this so many times before we get to the end of the book, but that's why this whole story of Joseph is here. To let us understand and to calm our hearts to know that God is in more of control than you can ever imagine. And that's why Paul, in the end of Romans, we read it a couple weeks ago, can say, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, God works out everything for good. You mean even in just incarcerations? Absolutely. You mean even the results of hateful people who spit at me and say horrible things? Exactly. Even when I sin? Yeah. Providence of God. God works it out for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Because God has a purpose. God will use unjust circumstances in your life to glorify himself. So in the midst of the worst situations, ask yourself, God, I understand in my head that somehow you're doing something to glorify yourself in this circumstance. I don't get it, but I want to be on board with whatever that is. So instead of coming to you every morning and whining, instead of whining, I'll say, God, okay, this hurts. I don't like the circumstance, but I understand that there's more than meets the eye here. So I'm going to wait for you to bring it to happen. That's what I'm going to wait for. So in the worst circumstances, anticipate with giddiness God glorifying himself, because that's the way he does it. Now, one more thing before we go past this. God is not immune to your pain in the middle of those hard circumstances. He knows that. He totally knows that. I could quote you many psalms. One of my favorites is the psalm that says that our tears that we cry in the midst of the hard situations, he captures our tears in a bottle. Not a single one goes without his notice. He knows that. Can you imagine a loving father who allows their children to go through painful circumstances because in the end, a greater good will happen? God loves you. He really does. And he'll restore you and he'll bring things around in his timing, but you got to understand that glorifying who God is and his loving kindness is more important than your whining circumstance. Okay? So that's just an important thing to remember. Let's go on to another thing I wanted to point out. Joseph was in a position of talking about bad news and good news. The good news is we have 7 years of plenty. The bad news is we're going to have 7 years of famine and everyone's going to die if we don't do something about this. And this was something that he had to continue to say during the 7 years of plenty, especially. And this is also our jobs. This is also our job. I know we talk about the good news because gospel in Greek means good news. But there's bad news as well. And as a mankind, even as Jesus noticed, lives like in the days before Noah, where they're eating and drinking and being marrying and all that kind of stuff. All this stuff is going on. There is a sense across most of mankind that, well, things are pretty darn good. So don't talk to me that I need to be saved, because what do I need to be saved from? This is pretty good. The bad news is all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And someday, not too far away, judgment will come. And they won't survive that. It's just like the 7 years of good and the 7 years of famine. So we have this I don't want to say duty, but we have this job from God like Joseph did to convince people, listen, it's to your benefit to recognize the bad news. That is the reality of your condition. It's to your benefit to grasp that and to get that. Because if you don't, if you go blind through the rest of your life, blind to that condition of what your real condition in sin is, it's not going to go good for you. And I'm not here to be holier than thou. I'm here to tell you that just like you, I'm in the same shoes you are. I come from the same blood you do. We are all fallen. We all fall short of the glory of God. That's the bad news. And someday this God creator who made this entire place, who owns this entire place, is going to bring due all the bills. And judgment's going to happen. And you don't want to be there with all of your sinfulness hanging out. It's to your good interest to listen to me about the bad news. But the good news is God's provided a sure solution. He's provided a sure solution to your problem. Again, Joseph had to go through saying, this is good, these are the good times, but bad times are coming. How can we survive the bad times, Mr. Joseph? You can survive them by giving me 20% of your grain right now, and then that food will feed you later. Trust me, God is in the business of saving you from this train wreck that's coming. God loves you and wants to see you get through this. And that's why he's brought me here. That's why he's given me this ability to speak what God's saying. That's why Pharaoh, for reasons completely unbeknownst to me, has made me in charge. God has done all of this at his initiative to save you. There's a sureness in his salvation. That's another message that we have to take to people. Once they understand the reality of their situation, the bad news, we have to say, but wait, God has solved the problem. He has taken the initiative. It's not about what you have to do now to fix it. It's about what he has already done on your behalf out of love. Here's the good news. It's very hard to talk about the good news of the gospel with people unless they grasp the bad news of the reality of their state in sin. Those have to go hand in hand. And for Joseph, those had to go hand in hand. Okay, and then lastly, this thing I call wisdom. And let me put my definition. Wisdom is just the application of uncommon truth to guide us into authentic life. Uncommon truth, I say, because we seldom in our flesh see things the way they really are. Many times what we do is we see things the way we want them to be. That's how we fool ourselves during times of plenty. Or when you say to people there's a judgment coming, then people say, well, now wait a second, look at me. I am largely a good person. So how can God, a loving God, judge me if I'm largely a loving person? Which is what you want to believe, right? I think. But you know what? We're dirtbags. Because left to ourselves or left in horrible circumstances with other people, we do horrible things. You want to believe that you're fundamentally good and able to make it through judgment. But that's not the reality. The truth, the uncommon truth, is much more severe than that. None are going to make it. None. And even if you violate one of these unrighteous things, God's going to say that's enough. That's enough for you not to survive judgment. So this uncommon truth applies not only in that, but even in what you do today in the midst of what we do. God, through His Word, has given us an understanding about the nature of man and the nature of God that is largely uncommon to most of mankind. And so mankind goes on its merry way doing what seems right, what seems true, what they wishful thinking want to be true. But in the end, there's some prudence that we can speak into people's lives based on the reality of the way things really are, the way they really are. Let me give you an example. What's he talking about? I got a call from a gal that, she was college age when I met her a long time ago. Anyway, she called me out of the blue from Wisconsin, and she says, my boyfriend, you met my boyfriend years ago, he wants me to move in with him and we can live together before we get married. So what do you think of that? And I had a long pause on the phone, and I'm thinking, well, I said, that is morally accepted amongst the common truth of the day. Yeah, I knew you were going to say this, she said. I said, no, wait, let me complete my thought. I know that's morally accepted. You can move in with him and no one's going to bat an eyelash if you're living together and you're not married. I mean, that's just where we live right now. When I was growing up, that would be like horrible, but that's accepted. So if you want to go based on the common truth that that's the way to go about pre-marriage is to kind of live together for a while and, do test drives on the car and see if it's going to work for you before you buy it, then that seems to make sense. But let me tell you something that's an uncommon truth about people. Okay, what's that? This is where wisdom comes into play. I said, well, the uncommon truth about people, and especially for women, but when you get in this relationship where you've moved in together, you're going to spend your entire time guarded and hoping that you don't do something stupid so that the person you're living with says, I didn't know you squeezed the toothpaste tube from the top. Well, that's it. We're moving out. I'm out of here. I'm not going to do this. But it's not. It's going to be more serious than that. Somewhere along the line, you realize that your relationship with this person is tentative based on them accepting everything about you. So you're going to live the most guarded life possible so you don't expose the true you. Because if the true you comes out, maybe they'll reject you. I said, that's just no way to live. Because from what I understand from God's scripture is we all, each one of us, are in need of intimacy. And intimacy, I'm not just talking sexual, but socially. We need intimate fellowship with somebody else. And to be intimately in fellowship with someone else, you got to let it all hang out. And to have that to happen effectively, you have to have a protection that the other person isn't going to say, oh, that's really weird, I'm out of here. And what is that protection? One day you'll stand together in front of hundreds of other people and say, I promise not to leave. No matter what. Whether it's in good times or in bad times, or toothpaste tubes squeezed at the top, or whatever it is you do, or you leave your socks on the floor, guys, all that kind of stuff. I promised one day back then, Dorothy and I stood in front and said, there's nothing that we can do in our relationship that one of us is going to turn and say, well, that's kind of weird. I'm out of here. So, we can let it all hang out. And intimacy happens, and the other person isn't going to flee because it's protected by a promise not to run. So I told her on the phone, do you want to live a life with this guy where you're always living guarded almost all the time, hoping you don't cross his imaginary line that you can't figure out what it is? Or do you want to live with him in a situation where you can actually let it all hang out, where you can love each other based on an intimacy of full disclosure, full disclosure? And they were naked and unashamed. That's exactly what it means in Genesis 2. So which would you rather have? And she said, well, gosh, I want that second one for sure. Well, then you're going to have to stand up in front of people and make a commitment and a promise that you won't run away from each other. So the answer is no. I said the answer is God knows you by design. He knows you by design. That's the uncommon truth. He knows you by design, and he's saying, if you want what his best is for you, I wouldn't do that. It's a cheap imitation of the real thing. It won't be intimacy. It'll be guarded cohabitation, but it won't be intimacy. And you'll actually, believe it or not, based on this uncommon truth, feel more alone than you were before. Is that possible? Yes. Are you guessing? No. I've seen this happen with couples. I've seen this. So, again, wisdom is taking this uncommon truth, and we're well informed in the Word about the nature of who we are, the nature of who God is, and applying that in a culture that doesn't know this uncommon truth, that's based on the designer's understanding and his love for us. And so we speak it. Joseph was in the situation of wisdom saying, friends, I can't give you a wagon load of grain because we're going to have 6 more years or 5 more years of this drought. I need to measure this out. You need to understand that God has provided this for us. You need to listen to me. Restraint is the rule of the day. That's the uncommon truth. And Joseph had to use these uncommon truths applied for what purposes? To protect his job? No. To lovingly care for the people. Sometimes you have to speak hard, uncommon truths for the benefit of other people. And it guides us eventually into authentic life. Now, I'm going to quit with this because this is just a super important thing. As you go through the Word, God does reveal the nature of who we are and the nature of who He is. And it's not just pie in the sky, heaven after we die, all that kind of stuff. It actually is highly applicable to right now. And God is in the business, because He's a loving Father, of trying to keep you from participating in the things in life that will hurt you. But we, in our wisdom, say, but it's socially acceptable for me to do this. The common truth is this. And you're telling me an uncommon truth. Well, that's because that's what's here. Why is that better? Because the guy who made us put it there. And He understands me better than I understand myself. So when we talk to people who aren't believers, I think it's just a very key part of the tone of how we talk, is saying this is God saying He wants the best for you, without question the best for you. And I'm not here to judge you in the sense of condemning you for your actions, but what I'm trying to say to you is you're settling for second best, maybe third best. The best from God is this. Not because I'm being dogmatic, but because the Creator, the designer, knows how we're made. Why don't you join me in this? Because that's life. There really is an invisible battle going on, and Jesus used this idea of a good shepherd and a bad shepherd when He talked about this, and Satan being the bad shepherd and Jesus being the good shepherd. And He says, did you know that the bad shepherd, this Satan, this influence of evil that's around us, that we live in his soup in that sense? Do you realize that as a bad shepherd, his intention is not to make the sheep get healthy? His intention is to steal, to kill, and destroy. And the common socially acceptable wisdom of the day is usually resulting in those things, although you can't see it up front. But Jesus says, trust me, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. And I came to give them life and to give it abundantly. So, you can go by the wisdom of the day, or you can go by the informed wisdom of the designer creator himself. Joseph had to use that wisdom to convince the people that what he was doing was for their best. For their best. Really, for your best. But that's a tough job, especially when it involves saying no about certain things. If you've got children, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So anyway, next week we'll find out what happens when we go to chapter 42. We'll find out what happens with this entire plan. Do they survive the 7 years of drought? Yeah. Oh, you read ahead? They do. But something even more miraculous happens. Even more miraculous. And that's providence of God. Okay? So let's pray. Father, indeed, we love you for the proactivity of your love to us, the initiative you take on our behalf for our benefit and for our good. And Lord, we are encompassed by common wisdom, socially acceptable wisdom that seems harmless and seems right. But Lord, in our experience, we've seen it go down such dead ends, such joyless dead ends of life. And so I pray that you would make us like Joseph, beacons of life for people who are hungry for something different, for people who want to understand how things really are. And Father, I pray that as a result of what you do in us through your Spirit that lives within us, that a light would shine, on the nature of who you are, and that people would come to fall in love with you, to come to embrace the situation, the reality of where they're at, the bad news, and in the same breath accept the plan of God on their behalf for their good. So, Lord, we understand this is a place that's fraught with lots of battles in that domain. Make us winsome and loving, and words that I can't even express about conveying your loving kindness to them in a generation that desperately needs you, and that is experiencing the joyless dead ends of the one who's come to steal, kill, and destroy. Thank you for calling us to yourself. We love you, and we're just excited to be called your children. When we least expected us, you adopted us into your family, and our hearts are still astonished. We love you and thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.